The test begins. Gregory Langston sat in his sleek, high-rise office, staring at the large window that overlooked the city. The skyline of Chicago stretched out before him, a testament to his success. From a small, family-run steakhouse to a national brand, his restaurants were now among the most elite dining establishments in the country. Yet, despite his achievements, something gnawed at him. He swiped his phone open, scrolling through customer complaints. The comments were growing more frequent. "I went to Langston's Prime last night. I wasn't in designer clothes, but I had money to spend. The staff barely looked at me. I felt invisible. Why does your restaurant act like only rich people deserve good service? Is this what hospitality means to you?" Gregory sighed and set the phone down on his mahogany desk. He had always prided himself on excellence, not just in food, but in how people were treated. He had built Langston's Prime with a promise of quality and warmth, but somewhere along the way, that warmth had disappeared. He wasn't an out-of-touch businessman. He had worked the floor, scrubbed the dishes, and cooked the meals in his younger days. He knew what it was like to serve customers and make them feel welcome. But when had that changed? Gregory leaned back in his chair, his mind forming a plan. He needed to see this problem for himself, not as the billionaire CEO, but as a regular, unknown customer. And that's when the idea hit him. The disguise. The next morning, Gregory pushed through his vast walk-in closet, past the neatly arranged designer suits and luxury watches. He reached the very back, where old clothes from years ago hung untouched. He pulled out a faded hoodie, a worn-out t-shirt, and an old pair of jeans. He put them on, feeling their unfamiliar weight. Then he grabbed an old baseball cap, one he used to wear before his rise to fortune. Stepping in front of the mirror, he barely recognized himself. Instead of Gregory Langston, the multi-millionaire CEO, he looked like a tired, middle-aged man who had seen better days. He let his beard grow scruffy over the past few days, adding to the illusion. But that wasn't enough. He reached into his wallet and removed all his credit cards, leaving only 20 crumpled dollar bills in his pocket. No backup. No secret way to bail himself out. This was about seeing the truth. With one last deep breath, he grabbed his keys and stepped out of his penthouse, leaving behind a world of wealth. The journey begins. Gregory always traveled in a sleek, black SUV, chauffeured wherever he went. Not today. He walked past his usual driver, who gave him a puzzled glance but didn't question it. Instead, Gregory took the city bus. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat and old upholstery. The seats were full of weary commuters, their eyes tired from long hours at work. A few people glanced at him, their gazes lingering for just a moment before dismissing him as just another nobody. He felt it. The shift. In his suit, people nodded, smiled, and greeted him with respect. Now he was invisible. A businessman in a crisp navy suit sat 3 seats away, checking his expensive watch. When Gregory accidentally brushed against him, the man recoiled slightly, shifting away as if afraid of being too close. Gregory clenched his jaw. Interesting. When the bus arrived at Langston's Prime, he stepped off, staring up at the grand, polished glass entrance. This was his restaurant, his empire. But tonight, he wasn't the owner. He was just a man looking for a meal. The first test. Gregory pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Langston's Prime was the pinnacle of fine dining. Soft golden lighting illuminated the elegant space, the air rich with the scent of seared steak, aged wine, and truffle butter. Waiters in pressed black uniforms moved with practiced grace, balancing expensive dishes on silver trays. It was a world of refinement. But it was also a world with strict, unspoken rules. As Gregory stood near the entrance, no one acknowledged him. A well-dressed couple entered behind him, and immediately, the hostess, a blonde woman with a flawless smile, greeted them warmly. "Good evening. Welcome to Langston's Prime. Right this way." She led them to a table without hesitation. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. A minute passed, then another. Finally, the hostess, her name tag reading Emily, glanced at him, her expression cool and indifferent. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone lacking the warmth she had just used seconds ago. Gregory nodded. "I was hoping to get a table for one." Emily gave him a quick once-over, her gaze flicking to his worn-out jeans and scuffed sneakers. "Judgment. Do you have a reservation?" she asked, already expecting the answer. Gregory shook his head. "No, but I was hoping you had something open." She sighed and tapped at the screen in front of her. "It's going to be at least an hour." Gregory arched a brow. He knew for a fact that 3 tables were currently open, always kept available for last-minute VIPs. He glanced around. Another man in a tailored suit approached the podium, and Emily's demeanor immediately shifted. "Welcome, sir. We actually just had a table open up. Right this way." Gregory exhaled slowly. There it was. Not just bias, but outright discrimination based on appearance. "I don't mind waiting," he said calmly. But before Emily could insist he leave, a new voice cut in. "I got it, Emily. I can take him." Gregory turned. Standing there was a young waitress, her uniform neatly pressed, her dark eyes filled with something he hadn't seen yet that night: kindness. Her name tag read, Samantha. Emily frowned. "Sam, we don't." "There's an open table by the window," Samantha interrupted, her tone firm. Emily rolled her eyes but didn't argue. "Fine, do whatever you want." Samantha ignored her and turned to Gregory with a warm smile. "Right this way, sir." For the first time that night, someone actually looked at him like a person. As Gregory followed Samantha to the small table by the window, he could feel the stares from the other staff. Whispers. Judgment. He knew that this act of kindness would cost her, and he had no idea just how far that kindness would go or how much it would change both of their lives. A meal with meaning. Gregory followed Samantha through the restaurant, acutely aware of the gazes fixed on him. He wasn't surprised. This was what he had come to witness. The hierarchy of service, the invisible rules about who deserved respect and who didn't. Samantha, however, seemed unbothered. She led him to a table near the window, away from the high-paying clientele in the center of the room, but still with a view. Gregory noticed how her movements were practiced but not mechanical, unlike the others. She wasn't just doing her job. She was making sure he felt seen. She pulled out a chair for him and handed him a menu, her eyes warm but slightly wary, as if she already knew the reaction she would get from her coworkers. "Take your time looking over the menu. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" Gregory glanced at the wine list. He knew the cheapest glass cost more than what many people earned in an hour. He hesitated, then said, "Just water, if that's all right." Samantha didn't blink. She didn't look down on him for ordering the least expensive option, nor did she seem impatient. "Of course. I'll be right back," she said with a smile before walking off toward the kitchen. Gregory turned his attention to the menu. He had read it 1,000 times before, helped craft it, even tasted every dish himself when it was first introduced. But tonight, as he sat there in a faded hoodie and old sneakers, the prices seemed almost mocking. He imagined what it would be like to really be in this position, to not be a wealthy man testing his staff, but someone who had saved up just to experience a meal like this. Someone hoping to be treated well, only to be reminded that they didn't belong. Across the room, the other servers ignored him completely. They walked past his table without a glance, too focused on serving the well-dressed businessmen and socialites sipping on expensive wines. The contrast was stark. When a man in a designer suit raised his hand, a waiter rushed over immediately, almost tripping over himself to provide assistance. But Gregory, he was invisible. Samantha returned with his water, placing it in front of him gently. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a little more time?" she asked, keeping her voice low, as if to shield him from any embarrassment. Gregory hesitated. He had money, plenty of it, but he wanted to stay in character, to push this experience further. "I don't have a lot to spend," he admitted, testing her reaction. "Is there anything small I could order?" Her eyes softened. "If you're okay with it, I can bring you a soup and some bread, on me," she offered, her voice kind but careful, as if she knew that offering charity in a place like this was dangerous. Gregory's throat tightened. She had no idea who he was. She had no reason to help him. But she did anyway. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. Samantha smiled, the kind of smile that said she wasn't looking for thanks. "I know, but I want to." And before he could argue, she turned and disappeared into the kitchen. Gregory watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions. He had come here expecting to see how badly his restaurant treated people who weren't rich, but he hadn't expected to find someone fighting against that culture from within. The whispers started before Samantha even made it back. Across the room, another server, a young man with slicked back hair, leaned into the hostess podium, whispering something to Emily. Emily glanced toward Gregory's table and laughed, rolling her eyes before turning her attention back to her high-paying customers. At another station, a more senior waiter muttered something under his breath as he passed by Samantha's section, shaking his head in disapproval. Gregory's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about bad service. This was a culture. A toxic, deeply embedded mindset that had poisoned his company while he had been too distracted by expansion and profit. A few minutes later, Samantha returned with a small bowl of soup and a piece of warm bread. The portion was modest, but it was plated with care, not just thrown together. She set it down in front of him, as if it were as valuable as the filet mignon being served to the VIP tables across the room. "Here you go," she said softly. "Let me know if you need anything else." Gregory looked at the food for a long moment before picking up the spoon. The soup was rich and perfectly seasoned, the bread soft and buttery. It was a meal made with skill, meant to be savored. But tonight, it wasn't about the taste. It was about the fact that someone cared enough to make sure he had it. Before he could say anything, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Samantha." A word. Gregory turned his head just in time to see Stephen Callow, the restaurant's manager, standing near the kitchen doors, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were cold. Samantha straightened, casting a quick glance at Gregory before nodding. "Of course," she said, following Stephen toward the back. Gregory watched them go, a slow anger bubbling in his chest. He already knew what was happening. Stephen had noticed her kindness, and he didn't approve. He turned his attention back to his meal, but his appetite was suddenly gone. Across the room, Emily, the hostess, and the slick-haired waiter were watching him again, whispering behind their hands. Every time he caught their gaze, they looked away quickly, laughing under their breath. Gregory clenched his jaw. So this is what it felt like, huh? To be treated as less than. To be pushed aside and dismissed. He had built this company to be different, to be better. But somewhere along the way, it had become just another elitist playground for the wealthy, where only those who looked the part were treated with dignity. And he had allowed it to happen. Minutes passed, and then Samantha emerged from the back, her expression carefully neutral. But Gregory saw it. The way her shoulders were a little more rigid, the way her hands were clenched just slightly at her sides. Stephen followed close behind, his face betraying nothing as he disappeared into his office. Samantha exhaled slowly before making her way back to Gregory's table. She didn't immediately say what had happened, but he could see it in her eyes. "They gave you trouble for serving me, didn't they?" Gregory asked quietly. Samantha hesitated, then forced a small smile. "It's fine. I just have to be more careful, that's all." Gregory studied her. This wasn't the first time she had been scolded for treating people with kindness, and yet she still did it anyway. That kind of loyalty, that kind of heart, couldn't be bought. but it could be rewarded. Gregory leaned back in his chair, his mind already made up. Tomorrow, everything would change. And the people who thought they held the power, they were about to find out who really did. The breaking point. The weight of the evening settled over Gregory as he sat at his table, stirring the last remnants of his soup with his spoon. The rich aroma of expensive entrees filled the air, but they felt distant, as if he were in another world, a world that didn't belong to him, not in the way it had before. He watched the restaurant's well-dressed clientele laugh and sip their overpriced wine, completely unaware of the quiet battle unfolding behind the scenes. Samantha returned to his table, her smile still present but dimmed, like a flickering candle against the wind. He could see it now, her exhaustion, the silent frustration tucked behind her warm demeanor. He had no doubt that Stephen, the restaurant manager, had pulled her aside to reprimand her. Perhaps he had warned her against wasting time on customers who didn't belong. Or maybe he had simply reminded her, in that sickly sweet way that corporate-trained managers did, that this establishment was about exclusivity, not charity. Gregory felt a slow, simmering anger build in his chest. "You don't have to pretend everything's fine," he said, keeping his voice low. Samantha hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "I just don't want any trouble," she admitted, keeping her hands folded in front of her. "I've worked hard to be here, and if I start pushing back too much, well, people like me don't always get second chances." Gregory frowned. "People like you." She exhaled softly, her fingers toying with the edge of her apron. "I didn't grow up with much. I had to work for everything. I'm paying off student loans, supporting my mom. This job, even if it's not perfect, helps keep us afloat. But it's hard when you know you have to keep your head down, even when you see things that aren't right." Gregory felt something stir inside him, guilt, admiration, and a renewed sense of purpose all at once. He had always believed his restaurants were built on fairness and excellence, but how many employees like Samantha had been silenced under his watch? How many had been forced to swallow their morals just to keep their jobs? His thoughts were interrupted when a sharp voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, waiter." Gregory turned just in time to see a middle-aged woman in a designer dress waving her hand impatiently at Samantha, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Beside her sat a man in a tailored gray suit, his expression set in that particular brand of entitled irritation that came from too much wealth and too little patience. Samantha stiffened but quickly recovered. "Of course, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman barely looked at her. "We've been waiting forever for our wine. And honestly, I don't understand why it's taking so long. Do you even know what you're doing?" Her voice carried, designed to be heard by the surrounding tables. Samantha's jaw tightened just slightly. "I'll check on that for you right away." But as she turned to go, the man scoffed. "Unbelievable. They'll hire just about anyone these days." Gregory's hand clenched around his glass. The words had been low, not meant for Samantha, but for his wife, yet said loudly enough that he knew Samantha would hear them. She did hear them, and she kept walking. Gregory had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with arrogance and power plays, but there was something uniquely disgusting about this, about the casual cruelty of the wealthy toward those they deemed beneath them. And the worst part, no one in the restaurant seemed to care. The hostess, Emily, was still smiling at the entrance, greeting well-dressed patrons with practiced charm. The waiters continued their elegant dance, tending to those who mattered. The rules of this place were clear. People like him, as he was dressed now, were less than nothing. Gregory had seen enough. He stood, leaving his unfinished soup behind. He had the information he came for. Now it was time to act. The next morning, the reckoning begins. Langston's Prime opened its doors as usual at precisely 4:00 p.m., its golden chandeliers casting warm light over the pristine tables. The staff bustled about, preparing for another night of service. None of them had any idea that everything was about to change. At exactly 6:00 p.m., Gregory Langston stepped through the doors once more. But this time, he wasn't wearing a hoodie and jeans. This time, he was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his polished leather shoes tapping against the marble floor with each measured step. His presence sent a ripple through the staff. The conversations at the hostess podium halted. The servers, who had ignored him just the night before, suddenly stood straighter, their trained smiles appearing like reflex. Emily, the hostess, blinked rapidly before plastering on her best customer service expression. "Good evening, Mr. Langston. If we had known you were coming, we would have." Gregory didn't answer her. He was already scanning the room. His eyes found Samantha immediately. She was in the middle of setting down a plate for a table, but when she glanced up and saw him, she froze. She knew. She knew exactly who he was now. A hush fell over the staff, spreading like a wave as more and more people realized the truth. Across the room, Stephen Callow, the manager, had just stepped out of his office. When he saw Gregory, he paled. He visibly paled. "Mr. Langston," he said after a moment, his voice suddenly polite, measured, the cold arrogance from last night completely gone. "What a surprise! If I had known you were coming, I would have." "Don't." Gregory cut him off, his tone calm but sharp. "Don't bother with the act." The restaurant fell into complete silence. Even the wealthy diners, who had been enjoying their meals, oblivious to the events unfolding around them, now turned their heads, sensing something unusual. Gregory slowly took a step forward, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "Last night, I walked into my own restaurant, and no one knew who I was." He let the words settle. "I watched my staff ignore me, treat me like I didn't belong, like I was an inconvenience. And the only person who treated me with dignity, the only person who acted like a professional, was her." He pointed directly at Samantha. Samantha's eyes widened, her breath catching. "She is the only one who remembered what hospitality is supposed to mean." Gregory continued, turning his sharp gaze back to Stephen. "And you scolded her for it." Stephen swallowed hard. "Sir, you're fired." The words rang out clear and undeniable. A collective gasp rippled through the staff. Stephen's face turned a deep shade of red. "What?" he choked out. "Sir, I've worked here for years. You can't." "I can," Gregory interrupted, his voice ice cold. "And I just did." Stephen's mouth opened and closed, his entire world crumbling in real time. He cast a desperate glance at the other employees, but no one stepped forward to defend him. Gregory turned to Emily, the hostess, who was still standing at the podium, paralyzed. "You," he said flatly, "if I ever hear about you judging a customer based on their clothes again, you're next." Emily nodded so quickly she almost dropped her tablet. Then, finally, Gregory turned back to Samantha. She was staring at him like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You deserve better," Gregory said simply. "Which is why, as of this moment, you are the new general manager of Langston's Prime." Silence. Then whispers. Samantha visibly trembled, gripping the edge of the nearest table to steady herself. I don't know what to say," she breathed. Gregory smiled. "Say yes." Tears shimmered in her eyes. Then she did. And with that, Langston's Prime was never the same again. A new era begins. The restaurant stood frozen in silence, as if the entire establishment had been plunged into a moment of suspended reality. Every employee, from the busboys in the back to the senior waiters near the VIP tables, stared in disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. It wasn't every day that the CEO of a multimillion-dollar restaurant empire walked in, fired the manager on the spot, and promoted a waitress in front of everyone. For a long moment, Samantha didn't move. Her fingers trembled as she held the small card Gregory had handed her, one that officially named her as the new general manager of Langston's Prime. Her mind raced, unable to process how quickly her entire world had just shifted. She had walked into work tonight expecting another shift of pretending not to hear snide comments from customers, of swallowing frustration when she was overlooked, and of staying quiet while her colleagues made judgments based on appearance rather than character. Now she stood at the center of a power shift that no one had seen coming. Gregory, his expression calm but firm, turned his gaze back toward Stephen Callow, who had yet to move from his spot. The former manager's face had gone from flushed red to a sickly shade of white. He looked like a man whose entire reality had just been shattered. His confidence, so evident when he had dismissed Gregory the night before, had completely evaporated. "Sir, please," Stephen started, desperation creeping into his voice. "This isn't fair. I've worked here for years. I built this place's reputation. You can't just—" Gregory cut him off with a sharp glance. "You built nothing," he said coldly. "You were given power, and you abused it. You treated people like garbage, and worse, you encouraged others to do the same. This restaurant was built on excellence, not arrogance." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Stephen could hear. "You stopped being valuable to this company the moment you started deciding who was worthy of respect." Stephen swallowed hard. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but there was no fight left in him. He knew there was no argument that could save him. The decision had been made. "I'll have security escort you out," Gregory added, his tone final. Stephen's mouth twisted in an ugly sneer, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and stalked toward the back office, humiliation clinging to his every step. His reign at Langston's prime had ended in the most public way possible. A nervous energy rippled through the staff. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if they would be next. Others, particularly those who had always resented Stephen's leadership, barely hid their satisfaction. But all of them knew one thing for certain. This restaurant would never be the same again. A new leader steps up. Samantha finally found her voice, though it was still shaky. "Mr. Langston, I don't know how to thank you. I don't even know if I can do this job." Gregory smiled, a softer expression now replacing the cold authority he had worn just moments ago. "You already have done this job," he told her simply. "You led by example when no one was watching. That's what real leadership is. You don't need experience managing a restaurant. You already have what matters most." Samantha swallowed the lump in her throat. "But what about the rest of the staff? They won't listen to me. I've been one of them for so long, and now I'm supposed to be their boss." Gregory's eyes flickered to the waiters, busboys, and hostesses who stood watching with varying degrees of shock, uncertainty, and curiosity. "Then it's time to set a new tone," he said, "one that reminds them why they got into hospitality in the first place." Before Samantha could respond, a voice spoke from the back of the room. "Excuse me, Mr. Langston." It was Emily, the hostess. Her perfectly manicured nails clutched the edge of the podium, her expression shifting between uncertainty and thinly veiled panic. Her voice was much different than it had been the night before when she had barely given Gregory a second glance. Now it was overly sweet, carefully measured. "I just wanted to say, I didn't mean any disrespect last night," she said quickly. I was just following Stephen's lead. But now that you're making changes, I'm totally on board. I think Samantha will be a great manager." Gregory raised an eyebrow. He wasn't surprised. The opportunists always tried to switch sides when power shifted. He had seen it in boardrooms, and he was seeing it now. "You had plenty of chances to treat me like a person last night," Gregory said smoothly. "You didn't take them." Emily's face fell, her fingers tightening around her tablet. I can change," she stammered. "Really? Please don't." Gregory glanced at Samantha, giving her a silent message. "This is your decision now." Samantha hesitated for a moment before inhaling deeply. "Emily, if you really want to prove that you've changed," she said, her voice steadier now, "then you need to start treating every customer the way you treat Mr. Langston, no matter what they look like. If I see you treating anyone the way you treated him last night, I won't need Mr. Langston to fire you. I'll do it myself." A few of the other employees stifled gasps. Emily looked stunned, not just by the words, but by who had said them. Samantha was no longer the waitress they had dismissed as unimportant. She was now their boss, and the entire staff felt it. Gregory gave a small nod of approval. She was already stepping into her role. He turned to the rest of the employees. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice commanding the attention of every person in the room. "I don't care what someone is wearing when they walk through these doors. I don't care if they look like they just stepped out of a limousine or if they just got off a bus. Every single customer is to be treated with the same level of service. If you can't handle that, then you don't belong in this restaurant." The weight of his words settled over the staff. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that their old ways would no longer be tolerated. "Langston's prime is changing," Gregory continued. "And it's not just about this location. I'll be sending undercover diners to every single one of my restaurants. If I find out that any location is treating customers the way I was treated last night, there will be consequences." A few of the waiters exchanged uneasy glances. Gregory's face softened slightly as he looked at Samantha one more time. "I want you to run this place with kindness and strength," he told her. "Not everyone is going to like the changes, but that's okay. The right people will stay." Samantha swallowed hard, but she nodded. "I won't let you down." Gregory smiled. "I know you won't." The first step toward something better. As Gregory turned to leave, a slow murmur spread through the restaurant. The diners, who had been watching everything unfold in stunned silence, were now whispering amongst themselves. Some nodded in approval, while others simply looked shaken by the abrupt shift in power. For the first time in a long time, Gregory felt something settle inside him, a sense of peace, of knowing he had done the right thing. Langston's prime would never be the same, and neither would he. As he stepped out onto the street, a cool breeze brushing against his face, he exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in years. This was only the beginning. But it was a beginning that mattered. The burden of leadership. The night Langston's prime changed forever was one that the staff would talk about for years to come. Some called it a wake-up call. Others whispered about it in corners, still unsure of where they stood in this new order. But for Samantha, it was something much heavier, a responsibility she had never asked for but now had to bear. The weight of the promotion didn't truly hit her until she found herself alone in the manager's office for the first time. The office had once belonged to Stephen Callow, a man who had spent years ruling over the restaurant with a mix of indifference and arrogance. The desk was still cluttered with the remnants of his reign. Notes scrawled in a messy, impatient hand, old schedules with shifts clearly favoring his favorites, and invoices that told a silent story of misplaced priorities. Samantha stood at the threshold for a moment, just staring at it all. It felt surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been another nameless waitress, just trying to survive another shift. Now she was the general manager of one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The room smelled like cheap cologne and stress. She wrinkled her nose. It was stifling, like the very walls had absorbed the tension of years spent under Stephen's rule. With a determined breath, she grabbed the old office chair and yanked it away from the desk, as if distancing herself from everything that man had left behind. She didn't need his presence lingering in this space. If she was going to do this job, she had to do it her way. Taking a seat in the guest chair instead, she opened the thick employee handbook that had been left behind. It was supposed to outline company policies, expectations, and procedures, but as she flipped through the pages, she realized something disturbing. The words were cold and impersonal. It was all about rules, efficiency, and maintaining the restaurant's elite reputation, but there wasn't a single page that mentioned how to treat the people who worked here. Not a word about respect, kindness, or fairness. No wonder things had turned out the way they had. A knock at the door startled her. "Come in," she said, sitting up a little straighter. The door creaked open, and Mark, the head chef, stepped inside. Mark was one of the few people Samantha had always gotten along with in the kitchen. He was in his 40s, had a gruff exterior, and rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. He was the kind of man who had spent decades in the restaurant industry, watching managers come and go. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "So, the rumors are true," he said. Samantha sighed. "Which ones?" "The ones about you being the boss now." She let out a small, nervous laugh. "Yeah, I guess they are." Mark studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good. About time we had someone here who actually cares." Samantha blinked. "You really think so?" He scoffed. Stephen was an arrogant idiot. The guy didn't know the first thing about running a restaurant. He knew how to make the right people feel special, but that's not the same thing as leadership. You were the only one who ever treated the kitchen staff like we mattered." His expression softened, just slightly. "So yeah, I think this place might finally be worth working at." Samantha felt something tight in her chest loosen. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. But before she could respond, Mark continued, his voice turning more serious. "That being said, you've got your work cut out for you. The staff is divided." She frowned. "How bad is it?" Mark sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Some of them are happy about the change. A lot of the kitchen guys are with you. They've been waiting for someone to actually notice how they're treated. But the front of house, that's a different story." Samantha tensed. She had seen the way Emily and some of the other servers had looked at her after Gregory's announcement. They weren't just shocked. They were angry. "They don't respect me," she muttered. Mark shrugged. "Not yet. But they don't have a choice, do they?" Samantha wasn't sure that was true. She had worked with these people for 2 years. They had once been her peers, and now she was expected to give them orders. That wasn't an easy shift to make. Some of them would fight it. Some of them would try to make her fail. And if she wasn't careful, they just might succeed. Resistance begins. By the time the restaurant opened that evening, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Samantha had spent the afternoon in meetings, reviewing schedules, and preparing to step into her new role officially. But now, as she walked through the dining room, she could feel the stares. The same waiters who had laughed behind her back the night before now watched her with thinly veiled resentment. Emily, standing at the hostess podium, was chatting quietly with another server, Jacob, a young man who had been one of Stephen's favorites. When Samantha walked by, they fell silent, exchanging looks before pointedly ignoring her presence. Fine, she thought. Let them whisper. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to fix what had been broken. "Hey, boss," a voice called from the bar. It was Louis, one of the older bartenders, grinning at her with amusement. "What's the first big change?" "We getting rid of the overpriced wine list." A few nearby waiters snickered. Samantha forced a calm smile. "Not yet," she said. "But we will be making some changes to the way we treat customers." Louis chuckled. "Yeah. And what's that supposed to mean?" Samantha looked around at the staff, making sure everyone was listening. "It means no more ignoring people because they don't look rich. No more deciding who's worth our time based on their clothes. Every customer who walks through those doors will get the same service, whether they're wearing a suit or sneakers." The silence that followed was heavy. Jacob scoffed. "So, what, we're just supposed to pretend a guy in ripped jeans is the same as a CEO?" Samantha met his gaze without flinching. "That's exactly what we're going to do." Emily rolled her eyes. "Sounds like a good way to lose tips." Samantha crossed her arms. "Or maybe it's a good way to build a restaurant that people actually respect." A few of the staff nodded, clearly on her side. But others looked ready for war. The CEO's watchful eye. Across the city, Gregory Langston sat in his penthouse, scrolling through the latest updates from his regional managers. The changes at Langston's Prime were already causing waves. Word had spread. His staff knew they were under watch. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. This was only the beginning. Samantha had the hardest job in front of her, not just managing a restaurant, but changing a culture that had been allowed to rot for years. And Gregory, he wasn't just watching. He was waiting. Waiting to see if she could turn Langston's Prime into what it was meant to be. And if anyone stood in her way, they wouldn't be there for long. The ultimate test. Samantha had always known that stepping into a leadership role would not be easy, but she hadn't expected the sheer resistance she faced in the days following Gregory Langston's visit. The moment she had been promoted, the restaurant staff had divided itself into two camps, those who welcomed the change and those who saw her as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. At first, it was subtle. The passive-aggressive comments, the accidental mistakes in orders, the way some of the senior waiters suddenly forgot to include her in key discussions. But soon, things started to escalate. By the third night of her new role, the tension had reached a boiling point. It was a packed Friday evening, and Langston's Prime was buzzing with affluent clientele, their laughter and polished conversations echoing across the elegant dining hall. The chandeliers gleamed, and the intoxicating aroma of seared steak, aged wine, and decadent sauces filled the air. Samantha, dressed in a crisp, newly issued manager's uniform, stood near the entrance, observing the flow of service. She had been making small adjustments, ensuring every guest was greeted warmly, watching to see if customers who looked less wealthy were still being ignored. And, as expected, some of the staff were testing her patience. A prime example, Jacob, the young waiter, who had been one of Stephen's closest allies, had spent the past 3 days openly challenging her authority. Tonight was no exception. Table 7 has been waiting 15 minutes for their drinks, Samantha said firmly, approaching him near the bar. You took their order 10 minutes ago. Where are they? Jacob, who was leaning against the counter, scrolling on his phone, barely glanced at her. Oh, must have slipped my mind. Samantha clenched her jaw. She could feel the eyes of the nearby bartenders watching. This was a test. If she let this slide, it would set a precedent, one she couldn't afford to allow. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice calm but firm. Get their drinks now. Jacob let out an exaggerated sigh, pushing himself off the counter. Relax, boss. It's just a couple of drinks. Samantha stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so only he could hear. No, it's about respect. And right now, you're showing none. For the first time, Jacob faltered, his cocky smirk twitching at the edges. He was used to getting away with things. Stephen had allowed this kind of attitude, but Samantha wouldn't. Finally, with a reluctant shrug, he moved toward the bar to retrieve the drinks. Samantha exhaled, resisting the urge to rub her temples. This wasn't about drinks or orders. This was about establishing control. And she knew she was running out of time to do it. As she turned to head toward the kitchen, she heard another voice. You handled that well. She turned to see Mark, the head chef, leaning against the doorway to the kitchen, arms crossed. His face held a rare expression of approval. Samantha let out a breathy chuckle. Barely. Mark shook his head. No, you didn't back down. That's what matters. He studied her for a moment before adding, You're fighting an uphill battle, you know. She sighed, glancing around at the restaurant. I know. Mark nodded toward Jacob, who was now handing the drinks to a table with forced politeness. They think you won't last. That's why they're pushing back. If they get under your skin enough, they figure you'll either quit or Mr. Langston will replace you. Samantha's stomach twisted, but she refused to let it show. She had spent too many years working her way up just to back down when things got tough. I'm not going anywhere, she said simply. Mark grinned. Good. And just like that, she realized something. She might not have everyone's respect yet, but she wasn't alone. The sabotage. The evening pressed on, and for a moment, it seemed like the worst of the tension had settled. The customers were happy, the kitchen was running smoothly, and even the waitstaff who had been hesitant about the new leadership seemed to be falling in line. But then, everything changed. It started with a loud gasp from the center of the dining hall. Samantha turned just in time to see a woman, a well-dressed socialite in an emerald evening gown, pushing back from her table, her expression twisted in horror. "Oh my God," she shrieked. "There's glass in my food." The restaurant froze. Waiters stopped in their tracks. Conversations halted. Even the kitchen staff, peering through the small window into the dining area, stiffened. Samantha's stomach dropped. The woman held up her plate, and sure enough, a shard of glass rested between a few pieces of steak. Her husband, a man in a sleek navy suit, looked at Samantha with an expression that was a mix of disgust and fury. "This is unacceptable," he spat. "We come here for excellence, and instead, you're serving my wife a plate of broken glass." Murmurs spread through the restaurant. Customers began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some whispered to each other, others stared at Samantha, waiting for her to react. Every instinct in her screamed that something wasn't right. Langston's Prime had the best chefs in the industry. The kitchen was immaculately clean. The plates were triple-checked before being sent out. There was no way a shard of glass had made its way into the food by accident. But the real confirmation came when she turned toward the waitstaff. Jacob was smirking. The slow, triumphant smirk. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't a mistake. This was sabotage, and it was meant to ruin her. The CEO returns. Samantha felt her heart hammer in her chest. If this moment wasn't handled perfectly, it would destroy everything. The restaurant's reputation, her credibility, everything. Before she could speak, the restaurant doors opened, and in stepped Gregory Langston. Dressed in his usual tailored charcoal suit, he exuded power. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath as his sharp eyes scanned the room, immediately taking in the shocked customers, the woman with the glass, and Samantha standing firm in the center of it all. His jaw tightened. Samantha barely had time to process what was happening before Mark stepped forward from the kitchen. "This isn't real," Mark said suddenly, his voice cutting through the growing panic. "That glass didn't come from my kitchen." The customers gasped. The woman at the table blinked rapidly. "Are you accusing me of lying?" she demanded. "No," Mark said, his voice steady. "I'm accusing someone else of putting it there." A dead silence followed. Gregory, who had been watching with sharp interest, finally spoke. "Samantha," he said, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority, "who was responsible for this table's food?" Without hesitation, she turned to Jacob. Jacob's smirk faltered. Gregory's gaze snapped to him instantly. "Well?" he asked, his voice dangerously even. "I'm waiting." Jacob swallowed hard. And suddenly, he didn't look quite so confident. The room waited. Samantha took a step forward, her voice stronger than ever. "He did it," she said. "I know he did." Gregory studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned back to Jacob. "You're fired." The words were absolute. Jacob paled. "Mr. Langston, I said," Gregory interrupted, his voice like steel. "You're fired. Get out. Now." Jacob staggered back, his entire scheme unraveling in real time. Samantha didn't look away as security escorted him out. This time, she had won. The dawn of a new era. An hour later, the chaos had settled. The customers had been reassured, and the staff had returned to their duties. But the biggest change, the respect in their eyes when they looked at Samantha. She had proved herself. As Gregory prepared to leave, he turned to her. "I told you it wouldn't be easy," he said. Samantha nodded, "But it was worth it." Gregory smiled. "Then I made the right choice." And with that, Langston's Prime was reborn. The restaurant had changed. Samantha had changed. And nothing would ever be the same again.